Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope you all are doing well, and I hope you all had a great week. Today, we're reading 3 more scary Craigslist stories. But before we start, what was the worst nightmare you had as a child? Please, definitely describe it. I'm very curious. With that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. I guess everyone has heard about a Craigslist horror story, but no one expects to end up in one. I had been thinking about leaving the city life behind for a while now. I guess I couldn't stand the bustle of it anymore, and longed for a more remote life. I'd saved up quite a bit of money over the years and decided to buy a house. When I saw the prices, though, my jaw dropped. I'd expected that buying a house was expensive, but I'd never thought it would be that expensive. In my desperation, I opened Craigslist. I didn't expect to find anything there, but that's exactly what I did. The ad was as simple as it could be. Small house for sale, way below market value. I clicked on it in an instant. When I saw the price, though, I was sure the seller had made a mistake. There was no way someone would sell a house that cheap. The place looked decent from what I saw in the pictures. Eventually, I found the seller's phone number and called him. I honestly expected the price to be a mistake. Hell, maybe it was all a scam. Instead, I found myself on a call with a man named Wilbert Johnson. When he told me the place was still available, the first thing I asked about was the price. The old man assured me there was no mistake. It was an old house, he said, in the middle of nowhere, and he wanted to get the sale over with as soon as possible. There was a catch, though. He wanted the payment in cash only, because he didn't trust the banks or any of the real estate agents. Some other people had shown interest before me, he said, but they had all gotten cold feet at the mention of this. I didn't see a problem with it. Hell, things would be way quicker that way. I guess that was my first mistake. To make a long story short, a week later, on a Saturday morning, I found myself on the 3-hour drive to old Wilbert's house, which I hoped would soon be mine. When I arrived, the old man greeted me with a bright smile. He was a sturdy, hard man in his late 50s, from what I could tell. "Are you Mark?" he asked, as he reached out to greet me. I nodded. "Yes, sir." "Well, that's the place," he said, and stepped aside to allow me a better view of the small house. I had to look around a bit before I stepped inside. The moment I did, the old floorboards welcomed me with a loud creak. The moment it all happened, an anxious expression washed over the man's face. "Guess you were right," I said, laughing. "The place is pretty old. It sure has character, though." When he heard that, relief flooded over his face, and his smile returned. "Oh, that it has. Been living here for over 30-odd years." "Now then, how come you're selling it that cheap?" The old man was quiet for a bit. His eyes wandered for a bit before he sighed. "I'll tell you what, there's no reason to keep it to myself. It's because of Lisa's disappearance." "Lisa?" Another sigh followed. "My wife, Elizabeth. Been almost 2 months now since she vanished. Walked right out that door over there and never returned. No one's seen her, no one's heard a thing. Just like vanished without a trace." Shit. I'm so sorry, I had no idea." "Nothing to do with you." He had cut me off. "Did everything I could. Talked to the neighbors, then the cops. Hell, they searched half the damned country, but they found nothing. I kept searching, but by now..." His voice trailed off as he shook his head. "Can't keep living here. Everything reminds me of her. That painting over there, she drew it a good 20 years ago. See that tablecloth? She bought it at a flea market a couple of years back." "Isn't it beautiful, Wilbert?" she asked. "Been stuck with the ugly thing ever since. Whenever I see it, I can't help but wonder where she went and what happened to her. It's just too much." He broke up, his voice trailing off again. I stood there, shuffling around, not sure what to say. I was never good at those things, people things, I mean. After a few moments, I opened my mouth when I heard something. It was a small, quiet sound, like scratching. In a moment, old Wilbert stepped up to an old radio and turned it on. I stared at him as the music drowned out the sound. "Sir, what are you—" When he noticed my stares, he looked embarrassed and turned the radio back off again. "Well, that's another reason the place is so cheap." "So, what's causing it?" "Ghosts." I stared at him, but his expression didn't change. I opened my mouth to inquire what the hell was up with that when he burst out laughing. "God damn it, I'm pulling your leg. It's rodents. We've had problems with those damn beasts for half a decade now. Don't know where the buggers come from, but they sure are persistent. They're digging through the dirt outside and crawling to the walls. Never been able to figure out how they do it though. Might as well be a cat in there too. Heard they sometimes crawl after mice or a cat and end up getting stuck." I shrugged. Well, I planned on renovating the place anyways. "Remember you telling me about that. I've got quite a bit of junk stored up. Been planning to give the place a good old once-over myself, but with Lisa going missing and all that, I never had time to do it." With that, he led me to his garage and presented me with an assortment of tools and materials. "I'll tell you what, I'll add all of it to the house for free. God knows I can't take it with me anyways, and I sure as hell won't need it anymore. Take it as an apology for not telling you about the rodents beforehand." I thanked the old man wholeheartedly. Looking at the amount of stuff here, I might be well looking at $50,000, hell, maybe even more. We talked more while the old man led me through the house. Here and there, he stopped me and told me what sort of renovations he'd planned, and gave me detailed advice. Start with the second floor, use this and that material, do this that way, and so on. It sounded like solid advice, and I could tell the old man knew what he was talking about. Once the tour was over, we shook on the sale, and I arranged to be back in a few days to finalize everything. The old man, in turn, told me he'd put together a little write-up of all his renovation advice. Once I was back, and I handed him the money, he sighed again. "Guess there's one last thing I've got to tell you. This place, well, it's got a history." I looked up, first the rodents, and now what? "It's probably all nonsense." He started shaking his head. "But Lisa always talked about that stuff. She said back in the day when folks still owned slaves, there's been a lynching out here. Never gave much of a damn about those old tales, but this time, I couldn't help but laugh. Was he pulling my leg again? Tell you what, I never believed any of it, but Lisa swore she heard wailing and crying in the middle of the night. To be honest, I think it's just those damn kids down by the creek." "What kids?" "There's this old shack down by the creek, not too far from here. Some local kids, teenagers mostly, hang out there, getting drunk and causing all kinds of trouble during the night. Well, it doesn't sound like anything I can't handle." It was a few minutes later that we shook on the deal. The old man handed me his notes and told me he'd written down his phone number. If I had any questions about the renovations, I should call him. Once he'd driven off, I stared at what would be my new home. Quite the place, I thought. Sure, I'd have to put in quite a bit of work, but there was no way I'd get a cheap property anywhere else. For the first couple of nights, I didn't sleep in the place. There was still the old man's furniture in there. No, to feel comfortable here, I'd have to get rid of this stuff first. To be honest, it felt weird, disposing of someone else's entire life and memories like that. Even worse was the damn scratching. And it was there, again and again. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it was more frantic. Maybe there really was a cat stuck somewhere. I shuddered a bit. I liked cats, and I didn't want to think about one of them suffocating in my walls. The next day, my friend Mike arrived. I told him about the house I was buying, and he said he'd be happy to help me out with the renovations. To be honest, I think he wanted to get away from his wife and kids for a bit, do some good old handiwork, and share a couple of cool ones with an old buddy. Well, it's quite the place. You really got it that cheap? Yeah, it's because the place is haunted and there are mice in the walls, and rats and cats. Mike gave me a weird look. Come on in, I'll tell you about it all over a beer or two. As the two of us sat on the floor, in what would be, one day, my kitchen, I told him all about old Willard and the stories he told me. As if to prove that I wasn't bullshitting him, the frantic scratching started again for a moment. He listened intently. It doesn't sound like mice to me. Could be rats, though. We're better off getting some poison or call an exterminator. I considered it for a moment, but then I shook my head. If we get an exterminator, they'll cover the entire place in chemicals or God knows what. I'd rather get started on the renovations. Mike shrugged. Well, I warned you. Don't blame me if we find some giant rat colony in one of the walls here. We shared another beer before we started on the work. There was a lot to do. The floorboards were old and rotten in many places. The wallpaper was stained, and old-fashioned, and some partition walls had to go. I decided, either way, we had a busy few days ahead of us. Hell, maybe even a week. It wasn't long before we retorted to the old man's method of turning on the radio. The scratching, while quiet, was still somewhat distracting. Mike and I made some decent progress on the first day. At first, he wanted to get himself a hotel room in the nearby town, but after a bit of back and forth, he agreed to stay. We spent the evenings talking about old stories from high school and college, and often Mike would tell me about his wife and kids. As much as he told me he was happy to have some time away, I could tell he missed them already. During our third night at the place, he woke me up in the middle of the night. "Dude, are you hearing this?" he asked me in a quiet, hushed voice. As I listened, I could hear the scratching, but there was something else. It was quiet, coming from quite a distance, but I was sure I heard it. It sounded as if someone was wailing or crying. I thought back to the old man's story about the lynching and what his wife had heard. Then I shook my head and remembered what he told me about the kids out there. Probably some drunk kids screwing around. The old dude told me they were gathering down by the creek to get drunk. Maybe they thought it would be fun to mess with the new guy. Mike nodded, but he still looked unnerved. Yeah, I guess you're right. Want to go out and teach them a lesson? I laughed, but shook my head. There was no way I'd go out in the middle of the night to chase some teenagers. I also didn't want to become known as the local crazy guy. Eventually, we got back to sleep. Still, somehow my mind lingered on the story. That scratching, that wailing. There was something about it that didn't seem to fit. The next day, busy with renovations again, I'd already pushed all those thoughts away. Guess that was my second mistake. We doubled down on our efforts, me trying to find a hint of those damn rodents, and Mike most likely wanting to get out of here. He'd always been the superstitious type. When the wailing started again on the fourth night, Mike told me he'd get a hotel room if it would persist. I retorted that it was those kids again, but this time, he wouldn't have it. Yeah, so you're telling me there's some group of kids out there that got nothing better to do in the middle of the night, 2 times in a row? Shit, man, I don't know. Maybe it's a cat stuck somewhere. I sure as hell don't believe there are any frickin' ghosts. Mike grunted but said nothing. For a while, I considered going out there to figure out who or what was causing it, but not long after I drifted off to sleep again. At this point, we were on the 5th day of renovations. The place was almost barren by now. We'd started on the upper floor first. After that, we'd taken down the partition walls and had stripped down the old wallpaper. Not knowing too much about renovations myself, I'd followed the old man's guidelines almost to the letter. That was my third mistake. So, what else do you want me to take care of? Well, you could clean the garage for starters, and that lawn looks like it hasn't been cut in months. Alright, hilarious, Mark, he said when he saw the enormous grin on my face. Tell you what, I started. How about we take a bit of a break for the rest of the day? Tomorrow, we take care of the floorboards down here, and that's it. God knows those need to be replaced. As if to prove what I'd said, I switched my balance a bit, and the floorboards creaked in answer. Sounds good, but if we hear any weird noises again, I'm out of here. I sighed, but nodded. Then, I realized something. I had heard none of the scratching today. Maybe our ruckus had driven off whatever rodents had infested the place. I didn't know a damned thing about mice or rats. That night, we sat together until long after midnight. I'd brought out my old laptop, and we spent the time with some old movies and a bottle of whiskey. Not a sound was heard all night. No more scratching, and sure as hell, no wailing. Told you there was no ghost here. I slurred. Yeah, whatever, he said, laughing. Taking care of the old floorboards was much tougher than I'd imagined, with a hangover that is. Still, somehow we made decent enough progress, and by noon, we were done with the first half of the house. Guess those rats really are gone, aren't they? I shrugged. Guess so. Not a sound. To be honest, I half expected them to linger below those old boards. Sure hope they stay the hell away. We continued joking around and having a good time. It all changed when we found the basement. As we removed the floorboards in the old man's storage room, we stumbled upon an old hatch. Once our initial surprise was over, we pried it open, revealing a staircase. Alright, man, what the hell? The basement, I guess, I said, matter-of-factly. Yeah, I ain't blind, but why the hell's it hidden like that? Things still hadn't clicked. Who knows? Maybe he just didn't use it. Hell, maybe it was infested by rodents, so he sealed it off. Yeah, or it's a secret serial killer basement. Dude, not funny. I cursed. Alright. You want to go check it out? As I looked down the dark stairs that led somewhere below, a feeling of apprehension washed over me. I didn't feel so sure about my words anymore. Finally, I nodded. We each got a hold of a flashlight and started our descent. There was no light down there for sure, and for a moment, I half expected the old hatch to be thrown shut by no other than old Wilbert himself. Shit, man, this is creepy, I mumbled. Will you stop? I don't like this any more than you do. Once we made it down the stairs, we found ourselves in a small, damp room. It was empty. Small, isn't it? Sure is, I said. The entire basement was no bigger than one of the rooms above. Wasn't a basement usually the same size as the house? At least there are no rats, I said. Yeah, but this wall here is kinda weird. What do you mean? Well, he started. Look at the moss and the dirt on all the others. This one's different. Looks kinda new to me. Now that he'd said it, I noticed it too. Sure, the wall was as damp as the rest, but there was no moss on it or anything. I watched as Mike reached out his hand and knocked against the wall. What are you doing? I asked. Shh. He shushed me. He went to one of the other walls and knocked there, then came back and knocked again. Sounds hollow. We both stared at each other. You think that's where the rodents came from? A minute later, we were down there again, starting to tear down the wall. After a few heavy hits, the first of the bricks collapsed inwards. I instinctively took a step back, expecting rats or mice to pour from the hole, but there was nothing. We inched forward, peeking into the hole, and that's when we realized what this was, the second half of the basement. Mike had already gotten his flashlight and beamed inside. At first, we saw nothing, but then we saw something on the floor. No, not something. There's someone inside. I pressed out. We redoubled our efforts, and soon we'd broken down enough of the wall to enter. The person inside had long gray hair, wore a dirty nightgown, and was female. The old woman's face was frozen into a mask of perpetual terror, and she was without a doubt dead. When I saw the long, bloody scratch marks all over the walls, it finally clicked. A moment later, I was back upstairs to call the police, telling them what I found. There was no need for them to tell me the woman's name. The moment I'd understood what was going on here, I knew who she was. It was Elizabeth Johnson, the old man's wife. Okay guys, yesterday was probably one of the worst days I've ever endured. And it all started with a phone call at about 7 a.m. I picked up my phone to see who was calling me so early, but since I didn't recognize the number, I just put it on silent and fell back asleep. When I woke up again 3 hours later, I saw that I had 12 missed calls and 8 voicemails. Panic started to set in, as I thought something horrible had happened to a family member. As I looked at the missed call numbers though, I realized that I didn't know who any of them were. I thought that was really strange, since if something bad had happened to a family member, I should at least recognize one of the numbers. Then, things only got weirder as I heard the first voicemail. "Hi, I was just giving a call about the house you have for sale. I saw the Craigslist ad and was hoping to figure out a time I could be given a walkthrough. Just give me a call back. Thanks." I figured that was just a wrong number and played the next voicemail. "Yeah, hi, I was calling about the house for sale on Craigslist. If you could give me a call back at this number, I'd really like to know some more about those murders before I take a walkthrough. Thanks, have a nice day." After hearing the second voicemail, I was really starting to wonder what the hell was going on. The other 6 voicemails were all pretty much the same, inquiring about setting up a walkthrough and wanting to know about the murders. After I finished listening to the last one, I needed to find out what the hell was going on. I called the last number to leave a voicemail and a woman answered. When I asked her about the house she was calling about, she said there was an ad on Craigslist offering a house for dirt cheap. But it was only so cheap because the post said that a couple of murders had been committed in the house. I asked her if she could text me the link, and she assured me that she would. About 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed, and I saw her number pop up on its screen. I had no idea what was in store for me by clicking on that link. When the web page opened, the coldest chill I have ever felt shot down my spine. What I saw was a picture of my house on a Craigslist for sale ad. What made it worse was that the picture had been taken within the last week. You could see the pumpkin that I carved last weekend. Then, I read the posting description. "I have this sweet little home I am putting up for sale. It is located in this town, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from the city. Enjoy all the seclusion and privacy that this house will bring you. My asking price is $25,000. Disclosure: there is a reason I am asking basically nothing for this house. The precious couple who lived there, a young man and woman, were murdered in the house a year ago. I figured I would get it out in the open now, so that I'm only contracted by people who are not bothered by this. Don't let this mishap dissuade you though. The neighborhood is very safe, I promise. You can call me here, anytime, day or night. I never sleep, and we set a time to take a walk through the house. My number is listed here. I look forward to hearing from you soon." I felt like I had been socked in the gut. What the hell was going on? How did they know my number? My name? I immediately called my girlfriend over to see. I could see the horror set in on her face as she looked at the ad. I didn't think I could feel any worse, until she pointed out how our car was in the picture. We were in the house when someone took these pictures. I immediately called the police to figure out what the hell to do. They informed me that I should immediately contact Craigslist to remove the posting. Other than that, there was really nothing else they could do at the moment. The only crime that had technically been committed would be trespassing. But since whoever took the pictures wasn't on our property anymore, they couldn't do anything else. I'm freaking the hell out, guys. My girlfriend was on the phone with her mom in hysterics for most of the part of yesterday. Today, we've just been on constant alert. Every sound we hear makes us jump. I think the worst part is, I know there's really nothing that I can do. I feel so violated and so helpless. Does anyone have a suggestion? Some way that we can feel safe in our own home again? Before we read this story, if you do like this, please feel free to donate to this author so he can continue writing more amazing stories. Thank you. I am a musician, not one of grave importance or even outstanding ability. Still, I consider myself a musician nonetheless. I can play with the best of them, and I know my way around an instrument or two. More importantly, however, I am a collector of various items ranging from the odd to the obscure. There is no rhyme or reason to my collection. It consists of anything that piques my interest that I can get my hands on. That is why when I saw an ad on Craigslist for a vintage, rustic, red piano, I couldn't help but reach out to the seller. The ad's title seemed normal enough. Old piano, free to a good home. I'd seen countless ads like this before. It was nothing out of the ordinary, and certainly nothing that would grab my attention. Still, I felt the need to click on it. Maybe I was bored, or maybe I just liked the idea of not having to pay for a potential addition to my collection. Either way, I gave in to my compulsion. Upon clicking the ad, I was greeted with an anomalous and intriguing story. It read something like this. I am offering my piano to anyone who is willing to come and pick it up. It is very old, but still playable. I can prove this upon your arrival. It is red and bears no brand markings. This is because it was made by my great-great-grandfather. This instrument is one of a kind. He went out himself and chopped down a redwood tree to provide the wood to build it. It took him many days to finally cut down the tree, and much, much longer to finish making the piano. Nearly his entire life was put into this thing. I, however, have no use for it. It has been passed down to my family many times over. I have no wish to continue the tradition, and the piano is currently taking up too much space in my home. I want it gone as quickly as possible. My name is Margaret, and you can reach me by phone at the number listed below. Serious inquirers only. Reading the ad sparked my curiosity. One of a kind. Redwood tree. How strange and absurd. I had to see this thing. It was half as remarkable as Margaret's description made it out to be. Then, it was a must-have for my ever-growing collection. As such, I decided to give her a call. Margaret answered the phone after the first ring and immediately asked if this was about the piano. Although I found this to be an odd greeting, I assured her that it was indeed why I had called. She seemed rather enthused. I too was happy to know the piano was still available. We set up a time the following day when I could come over and take a look at it. I hung up the phone, excited and bewildered. I had a feeling that this piano could very well be the centerpiece of my oddities. My collection spans many eras of history, as well as numerous countries. They range anywhere from the mundane to the wildly strange, but all of them are nothing if not great conversation pieces. Some of my favorites include a genuine voodoo doll from Louisiana, a tooth from a saber-toothed cat, a book of spells written by an alleged witch, and a piece of an antler from the world's largest moose. Being a musician, I also own countless instruments, too many to name. Each time I acquired a new item, my heart would race with excitement, with whatever it was I was receiving becoming the focus of my attention. The piano was no exception. I could not wait to see it in person. I woke up the following day with no resistance to my alarm. I was more than eager to start my day and head off towards a potential new addition for my collection. I swiftly went about my daily routine in an effort to minimize the time in between me and Margaret. She did say that she was an early bird and that I could swing by whenever. With this in mind, I showered, brushed my teeth, got dressed, and ate breakfast at a record pace, making it out the door roughly 25 minutes after waking up. It might sound a bit silly to be this worked up over a material object, but to that, I'd say you must not be a collector. This piano was my mission, and it was one I intended to see through until the end. I found myself at Margaret's house while it was still morning, as she was just 2 towns over from where I lived. It was a quaint cottage at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by shrubbery and woods. I noticed an old tire swing in the backyard indicating that it may have been the house she lived in as a child. Maybe her parents passed away and left her the house. Maybe the piano reminded her of them, and that was the real reason she was getting rid of it. My speculation was interrupted by a woman who came running out of the cottage to greet me. She signaled for me to come inside and went back in herself. This was no doubt Margaret. I never told her what car I'd be in, but I assumed not many people came out there in the middle of nowhere and parked in front of your house. I got out of my car and made my way up the stone walkway to the front door. In entering the house, Margaret seemed overjoyed to see me. It was something adjacent to a relative seeing you for the first time in a great while. It was odd, but refreshing. It certainly made things less awkward. We exchanged a few pleasantries before she rushed me over to the room that contained the piano. I could tell she was excited to show me it. I was just as excited to see it, actually. I matched her pace as we made our way to the room. Upon entering the room, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, just a few yards away, was the piano in all of its glory. It was a beautiful concoction of wood and ivory, the likes of which I'd never seen. It had such a striking red color, giving it an illustrious and bold finish. In the design, it was magnificent. Simple, yet magnificent. Highly original, and certainly one of a kind like Margaret had said in her ad. I stood there in awe and my mouth open. Margaret must have thought I didn't like it, because she quickly started going off on a sales pitch about its charm and history. She then went on to sit down at the stool in front of it and placed her hands over the keys. "I tuned it yesterday after your call. Now, let's hear how it sounds." Margaret began playing a beautiful piece. Not only did she play, but she sang as well. This is when I took my attention away from the piano and allowed myself to notice her. She was a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, very beautiful and very slender. She had had silver highlights in her hair, giving it a strange, albeit lovely luster. Her singing voice, accompanied by the wonderfully rich tone of the piano, captivated me in a way that I can't describe. It surprised me to know that she not only played, but also could tune the piano. Her ad made it seem like she wasn't musically inclined at all. I allowed myself to be taken by the song until she finished. Before I could compliment Margaret on her playing, she quickly began talking, continuing her well-rehearsed sales pitch. I don't know if it was her playing or her voice, but I was sold the minute she touched the keys. Because of this, I interrupted her. "I'll take it." She seemed astounded when I said this. "Really? You will? Wonderful!" We were both happy, and everything seemed fine. But one fact kept creeping and crawling in the back of my mind. I wasn't sold on the piano's backstory just yet, so I decided to ask her about it. Keep in mind that Margaret and I lived in the Midwest. "So, have you lived in this house your whole life?" I asked, secretly fishing for information. "Yes, as did my parents. This house is very old, older than the piano." "And your great-great-grandfather, he lived here as well?" I kept bombarding her with questions. "Yes, he did." "Well, redwoods only grow in California. So your great-great-grandfather traveled all the way out there to chop down a tree to make a piano and brought it all the way back here?" It was at this point that Margaret realized I'd caught her in a lie. She apologized to me and explained the truth behind the piano. It would seem that her great-great-grandfather actually did go out and chop down a redwood tree to make this piano, just like she said. But it was not a redwood. It happened to be a tree that was located near where we both lived, deep, deep in the forest nearby. Being an avid historian, Margaret's great-great-grandfather had known about this tree for a while. It was a local legend of sorts, and it had always been his dream to find it. Locals deemed it the blood tree. It was a sacred tree, worshipped by a Native American tribe many, many years ago. Anyone who finds the tree is said to live a long life, filled with luck and prosperity. Those who vandalize it, however, will forever live a life of fear and misfortune. Her great-great-grandfather, of course, fell into the latter category. Though she claimed to not believe in the legend, she did point out that he died of a heart attack shortly after finishing the piano. Margaret's story was wild and entertaining. Even so, I believed her. It seemed that her ancestor finally found the tree he'd been searching for and wanted to take a piece of it home with him as a trophy. A piano was a fitting choice, seeing as this seemed to be a family of musicians. As for the curse, I was not concerned one bit. Perhaps Margaret was scared, despite her disbelief, and that's why she wanted to give me the piano. Either way, I'm a skeptic at heart, so it's a win-win situation in my eyes. I gladly accepted the gift, dark past or not. Despite Margaret's lie and the piano being free, I attempted to offer money. She wouldn't have it. She insisted on me just taking the thing off her hands. That would have been fine, but just taking such a beautiful instrument from someone would not have sat well with me. It wasn't much, but I slipped an envelope containing $100 into her mailbox on my way out. After calling a friend over to help me lift the heavy piano into the bed of my truck, I took off from Margaret's house with my new collectible. I made it home with ease, and with the help of that same friend, I positioned that piano in a lovely spot in my living room. I had a new piece of my collection, and I was happy. All was right in the world, or so I thought. For a few days, my life continued on as it normally did. My routine remained unchanged. The only difference was the new piece of furniture in my house, the new centerpiece of my lovely collection of strange objects. After a while, I barely noticed it was there. Despite its beauty, it blended in with the rest of my home, much like the other items in my collection. On the third night after receiving the piano, however, something weird happened. Something most certainly out of the ordinary. I had just laid down to sleep and placed myself in a comfortable position on my bed. As soon as my eyes were shut, I started drifting into a light sleep. I had been exhausted from a long day at work. To my dismay, a loud bang coming from downstairs jolted me awake. I jumped up out of bed and took a moment to process the sound. I quickly realized that it sounded like the piano's fallboard slamming shut over the keys. That could easily happen on its own, had I left it open, but I hadn't played the piano even once since I procured it. So, how could the fallboard slam shut if it was never open to begin with? I raced downstairs in an effort to satisfy my curiosity and to put my mind at ease. What I found did neither. Upon walking over to the piano, I noticed that the fallboard was up. Not only did it slam shut over the keys, but it somehow opened on its own. No way. There was no way that was even possible. I discarded that nonsense that was swimming around in my overly tired mind, and chalked up the sound to being that of one of my neighbors. I also must have opened the fallboard when moving the piano and never closed it. That was the only explanation. I closed the fallboard over the keys and went back upstairs to bed. I ended up sleeping for the rest of the night. The next day was pretty normal for me. I woke up early, took a shower, brushed my teeth, and ate breakfast. I went to work and dealt with the stress that came along with it, just as I always did. The piano was the farthest thing from my mind. It wasn't until I got home that day that it made its way back in. I opened the door to my house and immediately felt a cold gust rush out from within. This was strange as I didn't leave the AC on, and it wasn't a particularly eventful day as far as weather goes. Brushing this off, I walked into the living room and set my jacket on the couch. I then looked up and noticed the piano, the fallboard. It was up again. That couldn't be. I knew that I'd closed it the night before when getting up to inspect the strange sound. I absolutely knew it. This got me thinking, was someone in my home? I sped around my house at full speed with a kitchen knife in hand, ready to attack an intruder if there was one. I raced up and down the stairs, covering every inch of the house. I checked and rechecked every room, making sure I was completely alone. As it turned out, I was. Eventually, I found myself back in the living room, in front of the piano. I looked at it once more and noticed that the fallboard was down. Was I going mad? No. I was just experiencing the side effects of a long day at work, nothing more. I must have just thought the fallboard was up when I came home, that's all. At least, that's what I told myself to keep myself from dwelling on the situation. Still frazzled from the stressful day I had, I made my way to my bedroom and attempted to catch some shut-eye. I changed out of my work attire and into my nightwear, then plopped down on my warm and comfortable bed. A good end to a bad day, I thought. As luck would have it, I wouldn't be getting any sleep just yet. Quickly, after shutting my eyes, I heard another sound coming from downstairs. This time, it wasn't a loud bang. No, not at all. This time, it was music. Not just any music either, it was the piano. How could this be? Was someone really in my house this time? Or could it be, was the piano playing by itself? Neither option sat well with me. With nothing but adrenaline to guide me, I ran downstairs at full speed to catch the culprit of those late-night antics. Upon doing so, the music stopped, and I watched as the fallboard actually slammed itself shut over the keys. My heart sank, and I stood in place at the bottom of the stairs, completely and utterly in shock. After a few more moments of being a statue, I raced back up to my room and locked the door behind me. In a nervous slur of movement, I ran over to my bed and leaped onto it, unable to comprehend what I'd just witnessed. I sat there, contemplating. All the while a vile mixture of fear and confusion brewed in the pit of my stomach. What the hell was going on? Eventually, the fear and confusion subsided, allowing melatonin to take over and do its job. I fell asleep and managed to stay that way until the next morning. I woke up to the sound of my alarm clock early the next day. I sat in bed for a few moments and wondered if the events from the previous night were nothing more than a dream. Now, I knew this wasn't the case, but I gave in to the notion anyhow. Living in a state of denial was better than living in a world where I was going insane. I was so good at indulging in this falsehood that I actually managed to convince myself that it really was a dream, or at least the product of an overactive imagination. It was a splendid defense mechanism, and one that allowed me to go about my day without fear or unease. I left, went to work, came home, and went back to bed. Everything was back to normal, just because I told myself it was. But lies only stretch so far. Eventually, the truth catches up to you. When you least expect it, that is. As I laid there in bed, ready to sleep through the night, I heard the piano once more. I jumped out of bed rather abruptly and assessed the situation. What the hell was happening here? Was I truly going insane? If not, was this instrument really playing itself? Was there really an underlying layer of this world governed by laws of the supernatural, allowing this piano to be haunted in some way? I thought about it for a few moments as the song went on, and then it hit me. This wasn't paranormal. No, it couldn't be. This was a cheap parlor trick. Margaret created quite the jest. She outfitted this piano to play itself, much like the player pianos they had in saloons way back when. This was just a prank, a laugh at my expense. That's why the damn thing was free. I ran downstairs to solve the mystery once and for all. Of course, as soon as I hit the bottom step, the piano stopped playing. I walked over to it calmly, confident in my new theory. I opened the thing up and looked inside, begging the piano to divulge its inner workings to me. It did, but I was surprised by the result. This was just a normal piano. Nothing extra was added in its creation to make it play on its own. Nothing at all. Stunned by this new revelation, I stepped back from the piano. My calm demeanor was no more. I stared at the redwood and ivory keys before me and almost felt compelled to ask, "What are you?" Instead, I remained silent. This silence, however, was quickly obliterated by the sound of music as the piano began playing by itself once again. I wanted to run, but terror kept me still. I watched as the horror unfolded in front of me. The keys were being pressed down harder than before, by some unseen force. The piece was also being played at a faster tempo. As if that weren't enough, picture frames began falling off the wall. It felt as though my house was shaking, albeit slightly. A lamp in the corner then fell over. bringing my attention to that side of the room. That's when I saw it. Standing right outside my living room window was a dark figure. I couldn't make out any features on it. The moonlight was not enough to reveal this living silhouette's identity. I had had enough. I gained some composure and ran back up to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and climbed back into bed. All the while the song raged on. The house continued to shake. The dark figure, for all I know, it could have made its way into the house. Knowing this, my heart and thoughts raced at an equal rate. I was beginning to believe that I was neither crazy, nor did Margaret rig the piano to play on its own. This was something entirely different, something not of this world. Just as I came back to this realization, the music stopped. So did the shaking. With nothing left to do, I slept. It was no easy task, but fear has to taper off at some point. It eventually did, allowing me to escape the madness of my world and enter the realm of unconsciousness. I would have been grateful for this, had it not have been short-lived. I awoke a few hours later to a house filled to the brim with utter silence. Honestly, it was so silent that I immediately took notice. Normally, I'd hear at least the house creaking, or even the buzz of nature from the outside, but none of these sounds were present. I got up and looked outside my window for a clue. The world outside my room was still. No wind, no cars, no animals, and no people. Nothing. It was peculiar. Sure, it was the middle of the night, but where were the crickets chirping? The frogs croaking? The trees swaying? Where was the life outside my home? For that matter, where was the life within it? I seemed to be the only moving facet in an eerily frozen world. I hesitantly ventured downstairs for any further indication as to why everything seemed to be suspended in time. As I reached the bottom step, I looked over at the piano. There was something off about it. I walked over to it and realized that a few of the keys were pressed down. I attempted to touch them, but they would not budge. In pressing the other keys, I realized that none of them would budge at all either. Unsettling, yes, but not so much compared to what I saw to the left of the piano. It was so dark, I almost didn't see it. Standing completely still next to the piano was that dark figure. When I noticed it, I jumped and let out an awkward and fearful grunt of sorts. The figure did not react. It was as if it was inanimate, along with the rest of the world. I decided to use this opportunity to my advantage. I crept over to the figure to get a better look at it. I noticed that it was wearing some sort of dark cloak, one that covered its entire body. In the face of the shroud, I saw nothing but pure darkness. I cautiously attempted to pull the hood off its head, but much like the piano keys, it would not budge. I stood there staring at the figure for a few more seconds before a familiar sound filled the room. The piano started playing again, and in an instant, the world came back to life. I could hear with it the sounds of my house, as well as those of the outside world. I also noticed that the figure in front of me had a swirling aura of energy surrounding it. It was a pelt of darkness wrapped around the shadowy figure, cloak and all. Before I could even react to its appearance, the dark figure hastily reached out to grab me with a skeletal hand. I fell backwards in fear. Scrambling to get up, I managed to stand upright and make a run for it. I bolted towards the front door, rushed through it, and raced to my car. I got in, hot-wired the damn thing, my keys were inside, and took off. From that point on, I was able to calm down. I had escaped, but at what cost? In a much less frightened state, I began to think logically. Was I just going to abandon my house and all of my belongings just because of this spirit? Was I going to quit my job and leave town? No, of course not. Just the idea of this was preposterous. Running away was not an option. Driving in circles around my neighborhood, I weighed my options. I could go back and try to destroy the piano. No, bad idea. That could make the spirit angry. It might attach itself to me in the process, if it hasn't already. I could tough it out for one more night until I come up with a better course of action. No, I didn't like that idea either, and that's when a solid plan came to mind. One I'm surprised I hadn't thought of earlier. I peeled out of my neighborhood in a fury and sped to my next destination. I was going to go back to the cellar. Surely she would know what was going on. Perhaps she could even help. At the very least, I could give her a piece of my mind for selling me a possessed piano. Either way, I would feel better. The drive was a blur. My mind was in such dire straits that I drove on autopilot the whole way there. In seemingly no time at all, I found myself smack dab in front of Margaret's house. Desperate and troubled. I knew it was late, but I didn't care. I had nowhere else to go. I couldn't call the cops or tell a friend. No one would believe me. Even if they did, what could they do to help? Out of luck and out of options, I walked up the stone path to Margaret's door. Just as I was about to walk up to her door and knock, something happened. My march was impeded. The dark figure from my house appeared directly in front of me, keeping me from reaching Margaret's door. I backed up a bit, confused and frightened, but the figure did not follow. I ran back to my car to make a gateway, but the figure remained at Margaret's door. Perplexed, I walked back up to the stone path. In reaching the figure once again, I examined it. It was still, just as it was in my house before springing to life. Keeping that in mind, I treaded lightly. I reached around the figure slowly to knock on the door, but I was stopped. The figure came to life once again and grabbed my arm with its skeletal hand. I tried to run, but it had such a tight grip on me that I couldn't move. Not only this, but I could feel its presence anchoring me to the ground. I can't explain it, but even without its hand, this thing had its hooks in me. I cowered before the figure, and it leaned over me, almost as if to say, "Leave this place." It then vanished into thin air, right before my eyes. I gained some composure, ran to my car, and quickly left Margaret's house. I spent the whole ride home thinking about what had happened. It would seem as though the piano would not let me return to Margaret's house. I was its owner, and that it is the way it would stay until I gifted it to someone else. The only issue with this theory is that I could not do that to someone else, even a complete stranger. The problem was mine to deal with, and mine alone. I would have to discover a different method to ease my woes. I arrived home shortly thereafter, and reluctantly opened the front door to my house. Everything appeared normal for the moment. I took advantage of this and headed up to my room. I locked the door behind me, not that it would help, and threw myself into the mess of blankets and pillows that was on my bed. The song started up again. I continued to lie down, sick of the repetition. I felt the house shake, but I remained unmoved. It wasn't until a banging at my bedroom door began that I started fearing for my own life again. It started off quiet, but soon grew louder. I jumped out of bed and started pushing my dresser towards the door. A blockade was the only solution I could come up with. After placing the dresser in front of the door, I rushed back to bed. Inspecting the door while the banging continued, I realized that both the door and dresser were moving. It was slight, but noticeable. Before I knew it, the dresser toppled over to the floor, spilling its contents as it did. Safety was too much to ask for, it seemed. I covered myself in a blanket, attempting to tune out the ruckus around me. The banging persisted, but I chose to focus instead on the song. For the first time, I allowed myself to properly listen to it. Upon doing so, I was pleasantly surprised. It was beautiful, dark and sullen, but beautiful. The clash of ivory keys coupled with the storming melody soothed me. It soothed me to the point that I could no longer hear the banging at my door, or feel the shaking of the house. It's almost weird to say that I was at peace. Relaxed, I drifted away with the song, seamlessly entering a state of sleep. While in this musical slumber, I dreamt. The dream world I found myself in was different from that of my usual dreamscapes. It was intensely vivid and ambient. Hard to describe, really. Words like surreal and otherworldly just don't cut it. The awareness I had is also difficult to explicate. Lucidity is too small a concept. This feeling required more explanation than that. I was completely aware of my surroundings in the sense that I could feel everything about it. I know that doesn't make much sense, but it's the only description I have to offer. Relying on sight to truly understand where I was, I became aware of the fact that I was in a forest. It was very dense, but I could make out a clearing up ahead. Instead of walking to it, I felt myself floating forward. Knowing it was a dream, I neither questioned this nor tried to fight it. I found that fighting narratives in dreams usually led to an early awakening, and I did not want to wake up to find the dark figure looming over my bed, or anything like that. I eventually reached the clearing. It was some sort of meadow. In its center was a tree, a very large red tree. All at once, I knew where I was. I could feel it too. This was the blood tree. This was the precursor to my piano. The building blocks of a haunting in the form of a plant. Just as I took it into sight of the tree, a person stepped out from behind it. He walked over to me as I watched. It was a Native American. I'd never seen one in real life, but I could still tell. He didn't look exactly like the ones portrayed in documentaries. But he wasn't all that dissimilar either. He was most certainly a Native American, I was sure of it. He didn't speak. He simply pointed at the tree. That is when the piano began leaking into my dreams. I could hear the song playing from downstairs as glowing lines ran up and down the tree. It was amazing, for the lack of a better word. The Native American then walked back over to the tree and put his hand on it. He motioned for me to come over and do the same. Confused and awestruck, I obliged. In placing my hand on the blood tree, I felt its bark. It was a remarkably lifelike feeling, especially considering I was in a dream. I also felt the glowing lines racing past my skin. It was an incredible sensation. I looked over at my new friend and noticed that his eyes were closed. He was in some sort of trance. Bewildered, I decided I should do the same, and so I did. With my eyes shut, I was greeted by visions. Visions of the tree's early life and purpose. They were visions of sight as well as emotion. I could feel everything that these people felt as they worshipped this ancient plant. It was breathtaking. The tree wasn't always red. It used to be a normal color. The red is none other than blood. But there weren't any sacrifices made there. Nothing like that. Willing Native Americans came up to the tree every year, sliced their hands open, and placed them on the tree. Their blood then dripped down its exterior. The glowing lines must have been the blood of each individual. Lifelines, if you will. These people were celebrating life and trying to become one with nature. This tree was the anchor that kept their community together, that kept their family from falling apart. This is where they would play music, laugh, and dance, and enjoy each other's company. This is where they enjoyed life. They were free from judgment and the worries of day-to-day stress. They were at peace in this one spot, at this one tree. My visions eventually led me to the burying of their dead. This too was done at the tree. Every native in this group was buried under the blood tree. One of their elders would then play a song on a small ocarina-like instrument. I recognized it right away. It was the song that the piano had been playing every night. It was their song of death. Abruptly, I snapped out of the trance I was in and found myself back at the tree. My friend was now sitting on the ground next to me, back against the bark. He had the instrument from my vision in his hand and began playing the song of death. I listened intently, but he would not finish. Instead, he handed it to me, motioning for me to play. I hesitantly accepted the invitation. I managed to get the hang of the potato-shaped ocarina rather quickly, as it was a simple instrument. As such, I began playing the song. The strangest thing happened when I did. The tree began wilting. Its bark changed from red to black, and its leaves started falling. I stopped playing, but the Native American motioned with his hand for me to keep going, so I continued. I kept playing the song and the tree kept wilting. My friend was ecstatic. Somehow, this is what he wanted, but I didn't know why. You know how something in a dream can be so perplexing, and it isn't until you finally wake up that you truly divulge its meaning? That is what happened here. Before the tree could fully perish, I woke up in my bed at home. I was consumed by an instant revelation. Margaret's grandfather had taken away these people's headstone. More than that, he took away their connection to nature, as well as with one another.
The tree and its spirits needed to be put to rest once and for all, and there was only one way to do this. I needed to play the song of their dead on the piano. The whole way through, without interruption. I can't explain how I came to this. The culmination of emotions I felt in the dream, joy, tranquility, confusion, sadness, they all seemed to point me in this direction. I know it doesn't make any sense, but, to me, it did. I got out of bed shortly after coming to this realization, and walked over to my bedroom door. There was no banging, no song, no nothing. The world seemed to be frozen again, a perfect opportunity to venture downstairs to the piano. I opened the door and walked at a normal pace to my destination, so as to not disrupt anything or break the illusion, so to speak. I calmly made my way down to the piano and sat down. I placed my hands on the keys and began playing. I knew the song by heart now, having heard it so many times already. Not only that, but the piano itself seemed to be guiding my hands across the keys. As I played, the world around me ceased to remain. The house began shaking violently, knocking frames and furniture all over the place. Still, I continued playing. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a dark figure standing outside of my window. This made me a bit uneasy, but I couldn't stop for anything, so I kept playing. I knew not the outcome of this nightly adventure, but I knew that I had an obligation to persevere. If not for the tree or its ghost, then for myself, I needed this nightmare to end. The dark figure kept disappearing and reappearing at odd locations in the room. Sometimes I'd see it right next to me. Other times I could feel it breathing down my neck. I paid it no attention despite my fear. I wouldn't let it ruin my chance at putting this haunting to rest, not when I'd come so far. Just as the shadowy figure appeared sitting next to me at the piano, and just as I felt the house stop to shake, I hit the final note of the song. How it felt can't be described in words. Cathartic is a good attempt, but nowhere near as alleviating as it actually felt. It was like a huge weight was lifted, not only off of my shoulders, but off of the shoulders of many others too. It was an indescribable experience. Basking in elation, I turned my head and noticed that the dark figure was still sitting next to me. It didn't look the same, however. The swirling vortex of darkness surrounding it was gone. It now seemed to be nothing more than a cloaked man. He slowly reached up and pulled the hood down from his head as I watched. It was my friend, the Native American from my dream. But how? Before I could bombard the man with any questions I might have had, he looked at me and smiled before vanishing. It has been many months since I was haunted by this piano, and I haven't heard a peep out of it since. It's still sitting in my living room, and I do play it from time to time. It is my best guess that my theory worked. I somehow had a hand in laying the tree as well as many spirits to rest. The ordeal still begs the question though, who was this cloaked man? Was he some form of death who wanted the souls of countless Native Americans put to rest? Or was he Native American himself? One of many of the spirits trying to cross over to the other side? Either way, my perception of the supernatural and paranormal has been completely reversed. How could it not after what I had been through? I've come to another conclusion as well. For as long as I live, I will never buy another piano off of Craigslist ever again. Thanks for listening, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your own story, the links for my email and subreddit will be down below. I've also created a Discord, so if you want to join that, the link will be in the description down below as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that said, have beautiful nightmares, and I will see you next time.